The Classical Style by Charles Roson. The coherence of the musical language.
One of the most important elements is the short, periodic, articulated phrase. This creates a more symmetrical and rhythmically varied texture. Another key element is the use of sequences. This creates a sense of forward motion and momentum, often used to build tension and release. The classical style also features a greater emphasis on balance and proportion. This creates a sense of unity and symmetry within the music. Finally, the classical style is characterized by clear and concise melodies. This allows the listener to focus on the melody itself, often accompanied by simple harmonies. The classical style represents a shift away from the complex and ornate Baroque period. It has had a profound influence on later musical periods and continues to be enjoyed today. From Baroque to classical. During the Baroque period, music favored a simple and unified rhythmic texture. This was due in part to the limitations of the instruments of the time. In the classical period, composers began to experiment with more varied rhythmic textures and dynamic contrasts. This was partly due to the development of new instruments, such as the piano. Haydn and Mozart were notable composers of the classical period. Their solo works began to incorporate a more symphonic style, with greater emphasis on dynamic contrast. Rhythmic transition in classical music. In the classical period, composers used discrete, well-defined elements to achieve rhythmic transition. These elements were often related to each other by being twice as fast or half as fast as the preceding element. Mozart and Haydn were the first composers to understand the new demands on harmonic movement made by the periodic phrase. They used dissonance and harmonic tension to introduce new and faster rhythms. Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto opens with a feeling of 2 slow beats to a measure. By the end of the exposition, we hear 8 quick beats per measure. This transition from 2 to 8 is imperceptible because of the subtle nuances of phrasing and the placement of accents. Understanding the importance of harmonic movement allowed Mozart and Haydn to create a convincing relation between different rhythms. Their success hinged on their comprehension of dissonance and harmonic tension. The art of balance in classical music. With the classical style, a means of transition can even become a thematic element. In Haydn's Quartet in C major Op. 33 No. 3 of 1781, the crescendo is perhaps the most important element of the main theme. The classical style during its first years of perfection was all about balance and symmetry. Let's take a closer look at the opening measures of this piece. The opening measures are not only a crescendo but also a gradual acceleration little by little. This represents an increase of pulse within the same tempo. Even the transition back to the feeling of 0 beats per measure is beautifully handled. This prepares the return to the uninflected pulsation of the opening. The delightful 5-measure theme demonstrates a kind of thematic relationship in which the logical steps are successively spelled out in the music itself. This demonstrates the importance of thematic transition in music composition. The harmony of this opening phrase is more subtle than it appears at first. Nothing but tonic with a little dominant thrown in at the end to define the key. The spaciousness is tempered with wit. No chamber music before this had ever achieved such a combination. Modulation to the dominant in classical music. Have you ever listened to a classical piece and felt a sense of tension and suspense? Well, modulation to the dominant is one of the techniques used to create this feeling. It's not always a quick change. Sometimes, it can be a gradual process that starts at the beginning of the movement. This technique is often used by first suggesting the dominant key and then gradually moving towards it. Another way to modulate to the dominant is to do it abruptly. This can be done by simply changing the key without any preparation. However, this technique is not as common as the gradual approach. In either case, modulation to the dominant is an important part of classical music. It helps to create a sense of direction and movement in the music. For example, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony uses modulation to the dominant to create tension and suspense. Baroque versus classical styles. Baroque works are undramatic in that their tension remains fairly constant until the final cadence. On the other hand, classical sonatas have an apparent relaxation of the relative major that is always compensated for by raising the tension. The dramatic character of the sonata calls for contrast, and when the main theme is vigorous, some of the succeeding themes generally take on a softer character. Haydn prefers themes of equal intensity and relies on harmonic movement for the necessary dramatic effect. The stability and clarity of the opening and closing pages of a classical sonata are essential to its form, and they make the increased tension of the middle sections possible. Beethoven and Haydn often combine both methods, first restating the main theme with changes and new details that show how it is reinterpreted by being transposed from the tonic, and then adding a new theme. In conclusion, the difference between the Baroque movement toward the dominant and the classical modulation is not only one of degree. The classical style dramatizes this movement, making it an event as well as a directional force. In Mozart's Symphony No. 338, the first 40 measures contain no melody, only conventional march-like flourishes and a harmonic pattern that eventually moves to the dominant. This opening serves to define the tonality and create a sense of stability. Haydn's Quartet Op. 64 No. 3 is another example of this technique. In this movement, one of the second subjects does not appear in the recapitulation. Instead, it is played in the tonic major in the development section. These techniques help to create a sense of balance and coherence in classical music. And they continue to be used by composers today. The power of classical music. The classical style is characterized by a contrast between dramatic tension and stability. This contrast is essential to the emotional power of the classical style. In Baroque music, the tension is generally lower and the stability is higher. In classical music, the climax is higher and the resolution is more dramatic. The recapitulation is a key part of the classical form. It is the section of the piece where the music returns to the tonic key and resolves the tension that has been created in the exposition. The use of symmetry is another important feature of the classical style. This creates a sense of order and stability, which contrasts with the dramatic tension of the music. The classical style is a highly sophisticated and expressive form of music. The expressive melodies and harmonies all contribute to the emotional power of the classical style. The classical style of reinterpretation. Haydn's Quartet Op. 33 No. 5 is a perfect example. An opening phrase becomes a closing phrase, creating a new meaning without rewriting or reharmonizing. Mozart's Piano Sonata K283 is another example. A phrase that modulates to the dominant in the exposition becomes a return to the tonic in the recapitulation. This sensitivity to tonal coloring is what sets the classical masters apart from previous composers. Mozart was the first to consistently use the subdominant for its relaxation of long-range harmonic tension. Haydn and Mozart knew how to weld disparate harmonies together. Their most disparate harmonies are not only reconciled but even explained by what follows as well as implied by what precedes. The classical style of reinterpretation can produce moments of astonishing poetry. Beethoven's Eroica Symphony is a prime example of this, using keys to bring tension to the heart of stillness. Contrasting themes in classical music. Contrasting themes have often been overemphasized and are not an end in themselves. It's the clarity of outline that is essential, not the contrast. The fusion of dramatic effect with symmetry and proportion demands a clear articulation of parts. Haydn's Military Symphony exemplifies this with orchestration, not contrasting themes. Transformation of themes, not their contrast, is what affects us most emotionally. Classical composers like Mozart and Beethoven demonstrate this. The masculine-feminine distinction in sonatas is a quaint observation. The opening of a sonata is often more direct and forthright, regardless of theme. In summary, contrasting themes are not an end in themselves. Clarity of outline, transformation of themes, and symmetry and proportion are what make classical music emotionally complex. Importance of internal contrast. Contrasting themes are a crucial part of the classical style. Internal contrast, both rhythmic and dynamic, is essential to the style. Before 1750, contrast was almost always external, rarely within a melodic line. In classical melodies, internal contrast is frequent and essential to the style. Reconciling dynamic contrast is as important as the contrast itself. Mozart's Sonata K. 331 and the Jupiter Symphony are examples of this. Classical form is the symmetrical resolution of opposing forces. This is seen in the large classical form and the classical phrase. The classical style has become the standard by which we judge music. The clarity of the parts and the whole in classical music is unparalleled. The secret of Mozart's composition style. Have you ever wondered what makes Mozart's music so unique? Part of the secret lies in his ability to expand the center of a phrase. Take the string quintets, for example. The central expansion in the G minor quintet creates one of Mozart's most passionate and intense ideas. The clarity and symmetry of the classical style are reflected in the audible pattern of the phrase and the structure as a whole. This is exemplified in Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata. The detachability of the different parts of the phrase allows for high contrast and characterization within the phrase itself. This is a fundamental compositional technique of Haydn and Mozart. Thematic development is the detaching of separable parts and their arrangement into new groupings. This is what makes possible the high degree of contrast within the phrase. In summary, the clarity and symmetry of the classical style are reflected in the audible pattern of the phrase and the structure as a whole. This technique is what makes Mozart's music so unique and timeless. The evolution of classical music rhythm. In the 18th century, the beats were nearly equal in weight with slight emphasis on the downbeat and upbeat. But in classical works, each beat has a distinctive weight and importance. The hierarchy of weight in classical rhythm gives each beat dynamic form and energy. For example, Haydn's quartet in E-flat Op. 33 No. 2 showcases the brilliance of his dynamic conception. The individualization of each beat is what sets classical rhythm apart. In comparison, Bach's minuets have almost equal weight beats, while Haydn's have a clear and strong characterization. Mozart's C minor Fantasy K. 475. In the 18th century, the symmetry of sonata form was a free response to symmetrically ordered material. It could take many forms, some of them surprisingly complex. Mozart's C minor Fantasy K. 475 is an example of the kind of material impossible for the ordered resolution of the sonata. Even in this work, the final pages have a firm symmetry, but there's no way of continuing without new material, tonalities, and tempi. The unusual form of this work is explained by its purpose. It is not a separate piece but an introduction to a sonata. In K. 475, to give the effect of improvisation, the opening tonal firmness so characteristic of the period is deliberately weakened. The form of K. 475 has a very subtle balance. The music has the sound of improvisation and all the advantages of organized form. Only in this way could it give such an impression of unity while sounding so rhapsodic. Baroque versus classical composition. In the Baroque period, the form of the chorale prelude was imposed from without, with successive modifications to respond to the changing phrases of the chorale. This is different from the classical period, where the structure of a composition is related to how its themes sound. In the classical period, all extra-musical considerations, mathematical or symbolic, became completely subordinate, and the whole effect, sensuous, intellectual, and passionate, arises from the music alone. The structure of a composition in the classical period is related to the way its themes sound, not to what might be done with them. This principle of audibility even extends to the cancricans, or backward version of a melody. In the late 18th century, all extra-musical considerations became completely subordinate, and the whole effect, sensuous, intellectual, and passionate, arises from the music alone. The classical style and extra-musical considerations. The classical style of music is not solely influenced by extra-musical considerations. Even politics can enter into music, but it does not play a determining role. In Mozart's Don Giovanni, the words Viva la Libertà may look fairly innocuous in the libretto. But the music itself brings out the full orchestra with trumpets and drums maestoso in an exhilarating passage full of martial rhythm. Similarly, in Haydn's Quartet Op. 33 No. 3, the buffoonery of the music is only an exaggeration of an essential quality of the classical style. This style was, in its origins, basically a comic one. The pacing of classical rhythm is the pacing of comic opera, its phrasing is the phrasing of dance music, and its large structures are these phrases dramatized. This relation between the classical and comic styles was remarked by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. The classical style of music is unique in that it can convey meaning and even humor without outside reference. It's a testament to the originality of classical comedy. Double meaning in classical music. The classical style allowed for double meaning in every composition. Haydn's D major trio H7 finale uses the L as a dominant of a flat major, turned into a musical pun with the D hashtag, which is the third of B major. Clarity of articulation is essential to classical music wit. In Haydn's Clock Symphony, the accompaniment is transposed into the upper register, giving the figure to the solo flute and bassoon. Haydn's B-flat major quartet Op. 33 No. 4 uses modulation to the dominant as a joke. The modulation gives a splendid formula for wit, taking the form of a surprising change of nonsense into sense. The civilized gaiety of the classical period makes its last appearances in Beethoven's Eighth Symphony. After that, wit was swamped by sentiment.